Greetings, my friends. Master Kosh. I just got back from the Vorlon homeworld, and boy, are my arms tired. Sorry, bad joke. Anyway, I'm back. Had a nice restful weekend. Got a brand new episode of Nerdology for y'all, and we're going to be continuing our series on Babylon 5. Today, we're going to be talking about another. This is going to be another character discussion. We're actually going to be continuing where we picked up where we left off last week with Susan Ivanova, and we're going to be discussing another part of the female Trinity, awesome Trinity of characters from B5, and that this today we're going to discuss Ambassador Delenn. We know quite a bit about Ambassador Delenn, as a matter of fact, although, as they say in the show, a Minbari never tells you everything and never tells you all, only tells you half of it at a time. What we know about Ambassador Delenn is rather extensive from within the show because they gave her a lot of character development, a lot of backstory, a lot of history. Though you have to piece together the history and the backstory on her, but it is pretty much all in there in the show and in the TV movies and so on. In particular, you can very much say that the first TV movie that they did in the beginning was, by and large, her story. What we know about Ambassador Delenn before she comes to B5 as obviously as an ambassador, as a representative of the Minbari Federation. She grew up on the Minbar homeworld, part of a very loving family. She wasn't necessarily part of the ruling class, but her family, and particularly her father and her mother, were very well regarded within Minbari society, very well respected. And her father was, I believe, in the Minbari government for quite a number of years. And in time, she herself went into government service. But she also was part of, if I remember correctly, she was part of what they call the religious caste, which we've kind of talked about in passing in terms of Valen and Kosh. The religious caste was more the religious center of Minbari society, and the Minbari themselves were a very spiritual, very religious culture in and of themselves. Even their warrior caste and everything had a certain spirituality to them as well. And throughout Delenn's her childhood and her adolescence, she went to Minbari Temple, learning all about their religious structure, their government, their philosophy, and all those sorts of things. Eventually, we do know this from the TV movie in the beginning, she studied under one of their greatest leaders, Dukat. And in time, Dukat brought her in as an apprentice of his into the Minbari ruling council, the Grey Council. Sorry, glasses are slipping. Anyway, what ends up happening, she's very much embroiled in the startup of the Human Minbari War. What you see happen in the TV movie in the beginning is there is an expeditionary force sent out by us, the humans, by EarthGov, by Earth Force military and everything, which is the military branch of EarthGov. And they're trying to find out all they can about the Minbari because they know so little about them. Earth Force knows quite a bit about the Centauri, about the Narns, many of the species that make up the League of Non-Aligned Worlds, and so on. But they know next to nothing about the Minbari. And what ends up happening is there's a misunderstanding, to put it mildly, between the human expeditionary force and the Minbari expeditionary force. Because the interesting thing is, part of the Grey Council, and include those there, Dukat and everything, decide, based on reports from the Rangers, that the Shadows have started to return to Zahadum. And Dukat says, well, we can go off what reports the Rangers bring us and everything else, or we can go to Zaha Doom ourselves and see if they in fact are there. And if they are there, then we can come back to our people and say, okay, it's time we stop building bridges and homes and start building ships and tanks. Well, okay, ships and guns, to kind of quote Ducat. And what ends up happening is Delenn's there on the main Minbari battle cruiser, and what happens is the humans or anything do damage the Minbari vessel, and just by sadly, Ducat is killed. The Grey Council is split about what they should do, whether they should take a minute, breathe, and try and figure out what's going on, what actually happened, if there was in fact a misunderstanding, or if they should retaliate and seek revenge against Earth Force. And Delenn is pretty much the deciding vote. And what ends up happening is she does say she's very grief stricken because she's studied our Ducat for so long that pretty much she's like, to hell with the humans, kill them all, wipe them all out. And pretty much they declare what would be considered a holy war because we, by no, well, there was fault on our end. The commander of the expeditionary force was very hot-headed, and he didn't deal with first contact situations all that well, and he gave the order to open fire on the Minbari vessel. And over the next, I think it's like 2.5, 3 years or so, the Minbari just absolutely wiped the floor with us, and Delenn starts to have reservations. She starts to have second thoughts and doubts about what she actually told the Minbari military, the warrior caste, to do, and that is destroy all the humans, wipe them out. To quote Darth Sidious, wipe them out. All of them. What ends up happening is the Minbari obviously discovered, due to their interaction with Sinclair, that Minbari souls and human souls are merging with the opposite race, and eventually the war does come to an end. And later on down the line, everything in the TV series, Delenn actually takes up residence on Babylon 5 as the ambassador for the Minbari Federation. Most people know this already. But anyhow, throughout the course of the show, in particular the first season, Sinclair starts to unwind the mystery, and eventually, at the end of season 1, Delenn goes into this cocoon type of she goes into this cocoon. It looks like something that a moth or butterfly would weave or what have you. And at the beginning of season 2, she's still in this cocoon and everything, and nobody knows what the heck is going on. Eventually, what happens with Delenn is she does emerge from the cocoon, and she's messed up and everything. Her skin is almost, it looks like it's reptilian scales on her skin. And her aide, Lanier, actually calls Dr. Franklin in to examine her, and Franklin presses down on the skin, on the scaly skin, and it breaks away, and you see normal Minbari skin underneath. Essentially, what happens with Delenn is she becomes a hybrid between humans and Minbari. She no longer has the bone structure, skull cap type thing on her head. She's still got this one piece that goes around the back of her head and to the front, but on top and down the back of her head is all blonde black hair. And she requests that, well, actually, no, it's Dr. Franklin requests to examine her further to figure out what exactly has happened with her. And what in fact has happened is she has taken on human attributes and everything. We've discussed this when we were talking about what happened with Sinclair / Valen. She did this to equal out the balance of the change that Sinclair went through to become a full-blooded Minbari, or he might have become a hybrid himself. But anyway, throughout the course of the next several seasons, She plays a very pivotal role in the war with the Shadows. And she and John Sheridan become the head of the coalition, or anything, of the Earth, the Minbari, the Narn to an extent, and the League of Non-Aligned Worlds against the Shadows. And she's also a go-between between Sheridan and Kosh, or Ambassador Kosh, and everything for a while, until Kosh and Sheridan start to build a rapport with one another. And I'll discuss that rapport when I talk about Sheridan. But essentially, what happens with Delenn and Sheridan, and I'll go ahead and discuss this here, um, they start to form a rapport, and that rapport builds into a friendship, and eventually that friendship turns into a romantic uh, relationship. Sheridan loves Delenn, Delenn loves Sheridan, and I think honestly that's honestly a very intriguing aspect of Delenn's character, because you have this woman who is in essence a hybrid, obviously a hybrid of human and Minbari characteristics, DNA, what have you, and she grows to have um, um, feelings for Sheridan. I feel obviously a full-blooded human, and I think honestly was a very interesting way in exploring. Um, I don't know if J. Michael Straczynski, the guy who wrote Babylon 5 and directed it and so on, executive produced it, did this intentionally. I like to think maybe he did, because even in the 90s, the idea of interracial relationships was still kind of a touchy subject. It wasn't as much so as it was after desegregation took place and the civil rights movement and everything had come so far and everything in relations between Caucasians and African Americans. And I think the fact that they have this interracial or interspecies relationship, because you have Sheridan, who is a human, you have Delenn, who is half human, half Minbari, is a very interesting way, and I think a very good, tactful way of exploring how the dynamics of um, interracial, or in this case, interspecies relationships can work. And I think it's done very well. It's done very tactfully. And actually, I think one of the great things about Delenn's storyline is she has to deal with prejudice, not so much from the humans, because John Sheridan's father is very accepting of Delenn. He doesn't see her as half human, half Minbari. All he sees is a future daughter-in-law. But one thing you do see on Delenn's side is there's a lot of resistance, there's a lot of suspicion, and so on from her own people, the Minbari, because she has gone through this change. And she went through this change because it was part of one of Valen's, Sinclair slash Valen's prophecies of the things that would lead up to the Second Shadow War. And I think within the show, that whole dynamic of exploring interracial relationships through the lens of Sheridan and Delenn was, as I've just said, it was done very well. You had the bias, you had the prejudice on the side of the Minbari towards Delenn, and not just towards Delenn, but also towards Sheridan, because they didn't particularly care for the idea that you had a human that was physically and romantically attracted to a Minbari. That was simply not done. But Delenn and Sheridan defy that convention. They don't particularly care. They care about one another. They love one another. And actually, at the end of season 4, Sheridan and Delenn do get married. And what ends up happening is she becomes his second in command, or anything within the Interplanetary Alliance. And she's a major part of that. And she's always by his side and everything. She's always helping him govern, always, because Sheridan has become president of the Interplanetary Alliance. And Delenn is very much a support for Sheridan. She's very supportive of him, but at the same time, she doesn't lose any of her own strength or any of her own character development and so on. And as the seasons progress and they finally come out on the other side of the Shadow War, Delenn is even more so a support structure, part of Sheridan's support system and everything. When Sheridan ends up going to Zahadum to confront the Shadows and everything, um, Delenn, Ivanova, and Lita Alexander actually go after him to see if they can rescue him. Unfortunately, they were able to at the time, but eventually Sheridan does get off Zahadum. And I know I'm going into a little bit of Sheridan here, but I'll do a full video on him and everything because of all the characters and everything, and there's a lot. Sheridan is very much the crux of this series. I mean, there are several tentpole characters within this series, but Sheridan is almost the focal point. Although all the characters are given equal screen time and everything, and what have you. But eventually, and this is seen off screen, it's not so much you don't see it on screen, but after Sheridan and Delenn get married, um, they conceive a child. And there's some worry with this, particularly on Delenn's end, because obviously she's carrying her and John's child. And there's some complications, but as far as we know, and if I remember correctly, Delenn does carry their son. I believe his name is David to term, and I don't think we ever actually see David on screen. Hold on. Oh, the wonders of owning a cat. Yes, we have a little cat, or yeah, me and my wife, we have a cat. But getting back to Sheridan and Delenn's child, you never see him on screen very much, if at all. He's alluded to more so than anything. But eventually, I think if I remember correctly, their son goes into the Rangers and becomes part of that organization. And there's some sort of mess up with him, and I don't know if he gets hurt or he gets killed or what have you. But we never actually see their son David on screen, as far as I recall. But at the end of the series and everything, um, they do a time jump and everything, which I'm kind of bummed that they did. They did this in season 5, but they did a time jump several years into the future towards the end of John's life. And the last time, series-wise, that we see Delenn and John together is in this episode. I think it's called Sleeping in Light. And as always, I will include links to video clips of everything I've discussed in regards to Delenn and a little bit about John in the description down below for y'all to watch. But what ends up happening is John. I don't want to spoil this because this is a big spoiler for those of you who have never watched Babylon 5. But all I will say is John leaves Delenn behind, but it's not. Hold on. Cats. You gotta love him. Especially ours. He's a curious little bugger. But anyway, later on, actually in season 4, you in the episode I alluded to before, Deconstruction of Falling Stars, there's this news report or something along those lines where you have a couple of academics and a news report discussing the Interplanetary Alliance. You have them discussing John Sheridan, and the academics start throwing some shade at John, and you hear very soft bells jingling in the background, and that is very common with the Minbari. And you see a very old, very aged Delenn come in using a very tall walking staff. It's almost as tall as she is. She's so old. And she defends her husband. And she says, John Sheridan was a good man. He was a decent man, a man of character. And how dare you defame his name and his legacy? And one of the academics, I think he's a professor or something along those lines, looks at her with this very snarky comment, says, well, of course you would say this, considering you were, and Delenn gives him this look like, Shut the hell up, you snot-nosed punk. And the guy just kind of turns his head and ducks it like a whipped dog, pretty much. But that's the last time we see Delenn chronologically within the TV show, and um, she lives to a good old age and full of years. And again, later on in the same episode, Deconstruction of Falling Stars, you have an allusion by the young monk in his chronology of the history of all the major figures within the Babylon 5 TV show, the universe, to Delenn and Sheridan and so on. I don't exactly remember what they talked about in terms of Delenn, but I do remember. I'm almost certain that they do mention her because she was such a pivotal character because of her participation in the Earth Minbari War, because of her participation in the Second War with the Shadows, and her participation in the Earth Civil War, and so on. But as far as Ambassador Delenn goes, and I'll refer to her by her full name, Delenn Sheridan. As far as we know, she took John Sheridan's last name. There's no allusion to the contrary, so I'm going to err on this one side and say, yeah, she took her husband's name. I think what you get from Delenn in terms of character structure and character arc is you have this woman who has been very isolated by her society for a very long time. And over time, she starts to understand how truly complex human beings are, in particular, John Sheridan. And eventually she falls in love with this man. And she breaks a lot of conventions. She was honestly, a lot of people have alluded to the fact that Ambassador Kosh was a rebel amongst the Vorlons. I would say very much that Delenn was a rebel amongst the Minbari people. She followed the path of her own heart. She followed her own mind. And very rarely did she. Now, I'm not saying she was closed minded or she didn't heed the advice of those wiser than her. She very much does. But she has to temper that with what's in front of her at the time. Because if she had gone down a different road, the war against the shadows, the Earth Civil War, and all this stuff might have gone very differently. But the fact that she is such a independent and strong-willed woman amongst her people is honestly a benefit to everyone around her. She's even able to convince Kosh at one point. I believe it's in season 3. There's some sort of saboteur that sneaks onto Babylon 5 and plants a bomb that blows up some sort of transport within Babylon 5, and Sheridan's life is put in danger. And very rarely do Vorlons ever listen to the younger races, but in this instance, Kosh and Delenn have been together for so very long that Delenn is able to convince Kosh, look, you know what's about to happen. You know what's coming. We need Sheridan. We need him alive. And you see Kosh come out of his encounter suit and rescue Sheridan's life. And I think that speaks very strongly of Delenn's character because she's able to turn the ear of a Vorlon, and they are not the easiest race to get to do something that's contrary to what they believe is appropriate. And you have her staying before the Great Council and saying, and I've kind of alluded to this already, look, Valen was our leader. He set up the Great Council. He told us all this prophecy of what was going to happen. He led us he led our people during the first Shadow War. But here's the deal. We can either blindly and foolishly continue to follow him even though he did not know everything, or we can follow our own path and grow and become better than we are. And she takes the staff of the leader of the Grey Council and breaks the thing in half and says that maybe the council should be broken and maybe it should be reformed into something better. And eventually it is. You have a complete shift of the Grey Council. Now it's still kept in the same structure, three, three, and you still have representatives from all three castes, but in this case, the religious caste and the worker caste are given more representation than the warrior caste, and that's the simple fact that she's trying to tell the Minbari people we need to start letting other people have more of a voice than we have in the past, and it essentially works. What she does works, and it changes Minbari society, and it changes it for the better. And not only that, they stop being so dogmatic. There's something I'll go into a little bit of my education here. Um, there's something we study in philosophy where you have these individuals who will come into certain points in history and be what is called a what's the phrase? What's the phrase? Come on, think. Essentially, they're a change maker, a maker of a change maker. And that may not sound necessarily right, but it's the best way I know how to describe it. And Delenn is very much a person that forces change to occur. And this can either be a negative or be a positive. In the case of Delenn, it was very much a positive for the Minbari people because she shakes things up. Delenn's not afraid to speak her mind, and there's still a lot of people in the Minbari government and amongst the Great Council that still hold very high esteem of Delenn. Even though she's gone through this change in how she appears and so on, she still is Minbari at heart and in her mind. It's just her outward appearance that has changed. And I think the fact that she created all this order to make the Minbari people better is a very powerful testament to who she was. And I very much admire Ambassador Delenn in some ways, and I'll tell a little something about this. Um, Obviously, this show took place during the 1990s, and me and my mother would watch it quite frequently. We loved it and everything. And I would look at my mom. I would just kind of stare at her and say, you know, I see a lot of you and a lot of grandmother in Ambassador Delenn. At this point, my grandmother had passed on and everything, so she never got to see Babylon 5. But my mom looked at me and she's like, yeah, maybe a little bit. My mother has this very dry sense of humor, and she doesn't take. It's not that she doesn't appreciate compliments; she does, but I think sometimes she has a hard time at seeing the same things that I see. But that was my character discussion on Ambassador Delenn, and next time we will be discussing Lita Alexander, and I think you'll will enjoy this enjoyed our exploration of her as well. So until next time, my fellow nerdologists, as Ambassador Kosh would like to say, I have always been here. See you next time.